The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon when Clara first saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. She had been walking for 3 days now, her feet blistered and her throat dry as old leather, but she kept moving because stopping meant giving up, and Clara had never been one to give up on anything in her 47 years of living. The prairie stretched endlessly before her, a sea of golden grass that whispered secrets to the wind, and she found herself thinking about her grandmother, who used to say that sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. Behind her, somewhere in that vast expanse, lay the wreckage of her old life. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man once, but the bottle had changed him slowly at first, then, all at once, like a dam breaking in spring, and that final night when his hands had become fists, she knew she had to choose between staying and surviving. He had dragged her from their cabin, thrown her into the wagon, and driven her out into the middle of nowhere before pushing her out onto the hard ground and telling her she could find her own way back or die trying. The wagon wheels had disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of her own breathing and the vast silence of the prairie night. But Clara had survived worse things than being abandoned, and she had started walking toward what she hoped was civilization, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart that refused to break completely. Now, as she watched that dust cloud grow larger, she found herself hoping it might be someone who could spare a drink of water, or maybe point her toward the nearest town. The figure that emerged from the dust was not what she expected. Man on horseback, riding steady and sure across the prairie, with the kind of posture that spoke of years in the saddle and a face weathered by sun and wind, but kind in a way that reminded her of her father. His name was Samuel Whitmore, and he had been working cattle on his ranch for the better part of 30 years, watching the seasons change and the land teach him patience in ways he never could have learned in any schoolhouse. When he saw the woman walking alone across his land, his first instinct was to ride over and offer help because that was simply what decent people did for one another. But as he drew closer, he could see something in her eyes that made him slow his approach. It was the look of someone who had learned to be wary of kindness because kindness had been used against her before. Samuel had seen that look in the eyes of wounded animals, and he knew that moving too fast or speaking too loud could send her running back into the wilderness where she might never be found. So he stopped his horse about 20 feet away and took off his hat in the old-fashioned way his mother had taught him, was proper when meeting a lady. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hair, and Clara noticed that his hands on the reins were steady and gentle, the kind of hands that knew how to be careful with fragile things. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried across the prairie without being harsh, "I don't mean to startle you, but you look like you might be in need of some assistance." Clara stood very still for a moment, studying this stranger who had appeared like something from a dream. Or maybe a prayer. She hadn't known she was praying. There was something about the way he held himself that spoke of reliability. The kind of man who would fix your fence without being asked and never mention it afterward. "I could use some water, if you have any to spare," she said, finally, her voice hoarse from days of silence and thirst. Samuel reached for the canteen at his saddle without taking his eyes off her face, and she noticed that he moved slowly, deliberately, so she could see everything he was doing. "There's plenty where that came from," he said as he held out the canteen. "My ranch is just over that rise, and I was heading back anyway if you'd care to ride along." Clara looked at the horse, then back at Samuel, and something in his expression told her that this was not a man who would hurt her, but she had been wrong about men before, and the memory of Thomas's fists was still fresh in her mind. "I can walk," she said, taking the canteen and drinking deeply of the cool, sweet water that tasted like salvation. Samuel nodded as if he understood something she hadn't said, and began walking his horse alongside, her at a pace that matched her own tired steps. "Been walking long?" he asked after a while, not pushing but making conversation the way neighbors do over a fence. 3 days, Clara replied, and then found herself adding, "My husband left me out here to die. She hadn't meant to say it, but something about the quiet rhythm of their movement and the gentle way Samuel received her words made the truth easier to carry. "Well," Samuel said after a moment, "he made a poor choice, and I'm sorry that happened. To you. But I'm glad you didn't die, because that would have been a waste of a perfectly good person." Clara looked at him sideways and saw that he meant it simply and completely, without pity or judgment, just a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue or the grass was green. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Clara found herself noticing things about this land that she had missed during her desperate flight. The way the grass moved like water in the breeze, the distant call of hawks circling overhead, the smell of earth, and growing things that spoke of life continuing, even in the hardest places. Samuel's ranch appeared gradually first as a windmill turning lazily in the afternoon air, then as fences and outbuildings, and finally as a modest house with a wide front porch that looked like it had been built for sitting and watching the world go by. "It's not much," Samuel said, "but it's sturdy, and there's always food on the table and a spare room for anyone who needs it." Clara stopped walking and looked at this man who was offering shelter to a complete stranger without asking for anything in return. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know?" she asked. Samuel considered the question seriously, as if it deserved a thoughtful answer. "I suppose it's because my mother always said that kindness was the only thing that made us different from the animals, and I found that to be generally true over the years." He paused and looked out over his land with the expression of someone who had learned to find meaning in simple things. "Besides," he continued, "everyone needs help sometime, and I've been fortunate enough to receive it when I needed it most, so I figure it's my turn to pass it along." Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, something she hadn't even realized she was holding. That first night in Samuel's house, she slept in a real bed with clean sheets, and when she woke the next morning, there was coffee brewing and eggs cooking on the stove. Samuel had already been up for hours tending to his animals, and when he came in for breakfast, he treated her like a guest who belonged there rather than a burden he had taken on. "I don't have much money," Clara said, "owed over breakfast, but I can work, and I'm good with my hands." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "There's always work to be done on a ranch, and I could use help with the vegetable garden, and the chickens seemed to prefer women's company for some reason, and so began an arrangement that neither of them had planned, but both somehow needed. Clara threw herself into the work with the intensity of someone who had spent too many years feeling useless, and Samuel watched her with quiet approval as she brought order to his somewhat chaotic household. She mended his clothes and organized his kitchen and turned the neglected garden into something that would make any farm wife proud. In the evenings, they would sit on the front porch and watch the sun set over the prairie, while Samuel told stories about his years on the ranch, and Clara shared memories of better times before Thomas had changed. Samuel learned that Clara had once taught school in a small town back east, and that she loved books and music and had always dreamed of seeing the ocean. Clara discovered that Samuel had never married because he had been caring for his elderly parents until they passed, and by then he had grown comfortable with solitude, but not necessarily happy with it. The weeks turned into months, and Clara began to feel something she had almost forgotten: the simple pleasure of being appreciated for who she was, rather than criticized for who she wasn't. Samuel never pushed or presumed, but Clara could see in his eyes that he valued her presence in ways that had nothing to do with the work she did around the ranch one evening. As they sat watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Clara found herself thinking about the night Thomas had abandoned her, and realizing that what had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something better. "Samuel," she said softly, "I want you to know that you saved my life in more ways than one." Samuel turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the house she could see the gentle smile that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "Clara," he said, "I think maybe we saved each other." The first frost came early that year, and with it the realization that Clara had been on the ranch for almost 6 months. She had written letters to her sister back east, explaining what had happened and where she was, and the reply had come back full of worry and offers to send money for a train ticket home. But as Clara read her sister's words sitting in the warm kitchen of Samuel's house with bread rising on the counter and the sound of his voice drifting in from the barn, she realized that she was already home. Thomas appeared one day in late autumn, driving up to the house in the same wagon he had used to abandon her all those months ago. Clara saw him coming from the kitchen window and felt her stomach clench with old fear. But when Samuel appeared at her side, she realized that he